It was a scorching summer day in London, the mercury pushing past 35 degrees Celsius as the sun beat down mercilessly on Windsor Castle. Tourists from all over the world flooded the grounds, their faces flushed from the heat, looking for any bit of shade or comfort they could find. The iconic landmark, steeped in history, was more crowded than ever as people lined up for a glimpse of the monarchy's home. The heat was unbearable, the stones of the castle radiating warmth, making the entire place feel like a furnace. Inside this sea of tourists, there stood one figure who seemed impervious to the oppressive weather and the commotion around him. Felix Langdon, a royal guard, was stationed at the lesser-known St. George's Gate, standing perfectly still like a living statue. His posture was impeccable, a clear testament to the years of training and mental toughness he had endured to be part of the prestigious Queen's Guard. To most visitors, Felix seemed like just another soldier doing his duty. But to those who knew, his presence was a symbol of an ironclad discipline that had been forged through grueling mental and physical tests. The heat didn't seem to bother Felix, even though his scarlet tunic absorbed the sunlight, making his uniform uncomfortably hot. The heavy bearskin cap, weighing nearly 2 kilograms, sat on his head, trapping the heat like a woolen blanket. Yet Felix remained unfazed, his eyes forward, his arms poised at his sides, his posture as straight as a rod. He had done this countless times before, standing still for hours at a stretch, all while the world around him buzzed with noise and distractions. But what most people didn't understand was the level of mental fortitude it took to endure such a job. It wasn't just about being physically fit, it was about being able to maintain absolute composure under extreme conditions, including provocation. Felix had passed every test to get where he was today. Not just physical challenges, but psychological evaluations as well. His ability to withstand discomfort, his ability to ignore the relentless chatter of tourists, the constant clicking of cameras, and the teasing comments from the crowd had earned him a spot guarding one of the most important royal landmarks in the world. Today, however, he was about to face something different, a challenge not from his training or the sweltering heat, but from an unexpected source, a tourist. Meanwhile, a few steps away, another figure stood, albeit not quite so stoic. Donald Trump, former U.S. president and always a headline grabber, had come to London for a visit. His presence, as always, was known before he even arrived. People recognized him immediately, and tourists in the area began pointing him out, whispering to their friends about the controversial figure who had led the United States for 4 years. However, Trump wasn't in Windsor Castle to just observe the royal guards in their perfect military discipline. He was there for something else, something far more dramatic. He had an idea that was bound to stir things up. It all began as Trump, feeling the sweltering heat, eyed the royal guard standing silently in the courtyard. The juxtaposition of his own sweat-drenched shirt and the guard's cold, unwavering poise caught his attention. Trump's instinct was to provoke a reaction. He wasn't unfamiliar with the spotlight, and he knew how to get it. So, as Felix remained unflinching, Trump plotted his next move. With a sly grin, he turned to his entourage, preparing for the moment. He was no stranger to controversy. He had built his career on it, pushing boundaries and making waves, often in the name of getting noticed. And here, standing in the midst of tourists in a heat wave, the former president saw the perfect opportunity to create a viral moment. "Watch this," Trump muttered to his companions, a mischievous glint in his eyes. He reached into his bag and pulled out a bottle of water, eyeing the royal guard who remained unmoving in the heat. Trump knew what he was doing. This was going to be one for the history books. He was going to make Felix Langdon, the royal guard, react. What he didn't know was that Felix had been trained to withstand far more than just physical discomfort. He had faced worse conditions in his career. He had stood under blazing sun, endured bitter cold, and even been poked and prodded by rude tourists. But he had learned over the years to remain still and composed, to disregard the world around him and focus on his duties. Trump's plan, however, was simple. He was going to splash water on the guard. Not just a little water, but enough to make a spectacle of it. He was going to see if Felix would flinch or even blink. It would be hilarious, a perfect viral video to share with his millions of followers. The entire courtyard was about to witness an unexpected clash of worlds, one that would soon unfold in the most dramatic way possible. As Trump positioned himself closer to the guard, the anticipation began to grow. Tourists nearby noticed his movements and started to whisper to each other. Some could sense the tension in the air, others just thought it was another one of Trump's antics. But Felix, standing still, showed no signs of acknowledging the approaching figure. He didn't flinch. His hands remained perfectly still, his rifle locked in place. It was as if the world around him had ceased to exist. Trump now stood directly in front of the guard. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what they assumed would be the inevitable response from the royal guard. What would happen next? Would Felix break his silence and react to the prank, or would he remain steadfast in the face of the former president's taunt? The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen, and it wasn't just going to be another ordinary moment for the tourists. It was about to become a historic clash, a clash of expectations, of humor, and of incredible discipline. With the crowd's anticipation hanging thick in the air, Donald Trump took his position. He stood facing Felix Langdon, the stoic royal guard, who had shown no sign of moving or even acknowledging the growing spectacle around him. Felix's perfect posture seemed to challenge anyone who dared to interrupt it. The former president looked down at his bottle of water, smirking to himself. It was a moment he had orchestrated, a moment designed to test the limits of this royal guard's famous discipline. "Let's see if he cracks," Trump muttered to his entourage, his eyes never leaving the unflinching guard. His gaze locked onto Felix's face, reading the slightest glimmer of sweat on his brow. Felix's composure was so strong, it made the former president's grin widen. Trump had dealt with public scrutiny and heated moments his whole life, and he saw this as another stage to perform on. But this time it wasn't about his usual bravado. No, this time he wanted to see if the guard would break. And it was going to be on his terms. He didn't have to wait long. The crowd had noticed Trump's move. Phones began to lift, cameras clicking, some already recording, while others whispered among themselves. "Is this for real?" one person said. "Is he going to do it?" Another voice chimed in. Felix remained frozen, locked in his position, completely unaware of the underlying chaos that was about to unfold. He was a royal guard, a man of military discipline, and nothing was going to break that. Trump took a deliberate step forward. The water bottle in his hand glistened under the harsh midday sun. He paused for a second, savoring the moment. The crowd had begun to murmur, sensing something big was coming. Felix didn't move. His eyes were still forward, unwavering. The suspense was almost unbearable. With a sudden motion, Trump tilted the bottle upward and took a long drink, deliberately making sure the entire courtyard could see him. His gulp was exaggerated, and the water dripped down his chin. As he lowered the bottle, he smirked and made sure to splash some of the water onto the stones at Felix's feet. He glanced at the people around him, noticing the mixed reactions. Some tourists seemed entertained, others were confused, and a few disapproved of the scene, but all had their eyes locked on the unfolding interaction. It was at that moment that Felix Langdon's composure began to show its true strength. He had endured public scrutiny before. He had faced criticism, pranks, and rude tourists who thought they could break his discipline. But he had learned to rise above it all, to stand his ground with a strength that went beyond physical presence. Felix wasn't just a soldier on duty. He was a symbol of patience and unshakable resolve. Trump didn't see it coming. As he stood there expecting to see the royal guard flinch, something unexpected happened. Felix's eyes, which had been fixed ahead, turned slowly to meet Trump's gaze. It was a sharp shift. The intensity in Felix's stare was palpable. A subtle tightening of his jaw was the only outward sign that he had registered the interruption. Felix didn't say a word, but his presence spoke volumes. The crowd, sensing the shift in the air, grew silent. What had once been a chaotic, attention-grabbing spectacle was now on the verge of escalating into something more serious. The movement was slow but deliberate. Felix's posture remained unbroken, but now his actions seemed to be channeling the force of everything he had endured over the years. Trump's smirk began to fade. Without a word, Felix took a calculated step. His hand shot out with such precision that it was almost impossible for anyone to follow. In one swift motion, he snatched the bottle of water from Trump's hand. There was no hesitation, no wasted effort, just perfect precision, a move so swift and controlled it left everyone in the vicinity stunned. Trump's eyes widened in surprise. "Hey!" Trump protested, his confidence faltering. "That's my bottle!" Felix didn't flinch. He raised the water bottle to eye level, inspecting it carefully, all while maintaining unbroken eye contact with Trump. His movements were slow and measured, every action deliberate, as though he were in complete control of the situation. And then, without breaking his gaze, Felix tipped the bottle over, pouring a small, calculated amount of water into his gloved palm. For a moment, Felix simply wiped his face with the water, as if to remove the droplets that had splashed onto him earlier. It was a move so methodical, so focused, that it left everyone in awe. The water dripped down Felix's fingers, but the motion was so precise that it felt more like a controlled act of restraint than anything else. Trump, who had been anticipating the guard's reaction for a viral moment, now found himself facing a man who had exceeded all expectations. Felix didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he maintained his silence and poise, demonstrating the kind of self-discipline that made him a royal guard. The crowd remained silent, almost as if they too were waiting for the next move. No one dared to speak, as Felix's actions spoke louder than any words could have. He had done something far more powerful than reacting with anger or frustration. Felix had shown true strength in restraint, displaying the professionalism and dignity of someone who was in complete control of himself, his environment, and the situation. For a moment, Trump stood frozen, unsure of how to react. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a sudden awareness of the mistake he had just made. This wasn't just some staged viral moment. This was a man doing his job, standing guard in the face of ridicule and provocation, but never losing his cool. The former president could feel the weight of Felix's gaze, and for the first time in a long while, Trump realized he had underestimated the situation. Felix, now having wiped the water from his face, resumed his position as a royal guard. His posture was once again perfect, his rifle steady by his side. The action had been swift, efficient, and without emotion. Felix had returned to the dignified silence that was expected of him, but now the entire courtyard was aware of the quiet power he had demonstrated. The crowd, once filled with whispers and murmurs of curiosity, was now hushed in reverence. They had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a moment of confrontation, but a demonstration of professional poise in the face of provocation. Felix Langdon had shown that strength wasn't about reacting in anger. It was about maintaining control, even when faced with the most disrespectful behavior. The lesson was clear. Respect is earned, and sometimes the greatest response to provocation is silence. Trump, still standing there, realized he had not just failed to get the reaction he wanted. He had instead become a part of a lesson in humility and dignity. The camera in his hand now felt heavier, as if it could no longer capture the moment he had hoped for. Felix Langdon had turned the tables in a way no one expected, and it left everyone watching in awe. The tension that had been building since the moment Trump stepped forward with his water bottle now reached its peak. The crowd, who had been half anticipating a viral spectacle, suddenly found themselves drawn into something far more profound. What they thought would be a simple moment of disruption had turned into a masterclass in discipline and restraint. Felix Langdon, standing still as a royal guard, had quietly, almost imperceptibly, shifted the balance of power in the courtyard. For a few seconds, the courtyard was completely silent. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what was about to unfold. Even the security officers, who had been standing watch in the distance, took a moment to assess the situation. No one moved. Everyone stood in stunned anticipation of what Felix would do next. Trump, still standing there, began to realize that he wasn't in control of the situation. His earlier bravado seemed misplaced now, and the smirk that had once been firmly in place began to fade. He took a half step back, a gesture that spoke volumes. His posture, once filled with confidence, now felt uncertain. His eyes met Felix's, but this time, there was no playful challenge in them, only something that resembled recognition, perhaps even admiration. Felix Langdon, the royal guard, stood unmoving, his gaze still fixed forward. But the world around him had shifted. The very air seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, who had been whispering and murmuring about the potential for viral content, now found themselves witnessing something far more rare. They weren't just seeing a guard hold his ground. They were seeing a man who had mastered the art of control, someone who knew exactly how to assert power without ever raising a hand in violence or anger. This moment, far from being an embarrassing spectacle for Felix, was a resounding victory for the Royal Guard's training. Felix didn't need to speak to make his point. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. And what's more, he had done it with grace and dignity, standing his ground without a hint of weakness. For those watching, it was a clear demonstration of the power of patience and discipline. In the crowd, some tourists began to stir, exchanging glances. The elderly British couple who had been distributing water earlier moved forward, their faces flushed with indignation. They had witnessed the entire exchange unfold, and their anger was palpable. "That was no accident," the elderly woman called out, her voice sharp and filled with disapproval. "That's just disrespect." Trump, seemingly caught off guard by the reaction, tried to mask his discomfort with a defensive posture. He glanced at his phone, trying to regain his composure and prepare for whatever would come next. But Felix's earlier words still hung in the air, and they had a weight to them that couldn't be ignored. Felix was not just a guard, not just a soldier on duty. He was a man whose pride in his role had surpassed all expectations, and he had now become an embodiment of true strength and dignity. The crowd around them began to shift, with more and more people becoming aware of what had transpired. Tourists had moved back, making space, not because they feared a confrontation, but because they recognized that Felix had done something that transcended the petty provocation they had been witnessing. Felix's control over his emotions and his actions had made it clear that this was a moment to be respected, not mocked. For Trump, the reality of the situation was becoming clear. He had been outplayed, outclassed by the very discipline he had initially sought to challenge. He had expected a reaction, perhaps even a show of anger, something that could fuel his narrative for attention. But Felix's silent strength was far more powerful. Trump's earlier attempts at mockery now seemed shallow in comparison, and just as the situation seemed to hang in a delicate balance, Felix moved. His actions were swift and precise, an almost mechanical movement that reflected years of training and dedication. Without breaking eye contact with Trump, Felix executed a perfect quarter turn. His stance shifted, not out of anger, but with purpose, an undeniable sign of his professional training. The movement was sharp, a direct contrast to Trump's earlier, more theatrical gestures. The audience around them could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They were no longer witnessing a prank. They were witnessing a soldier's response to the provocation. Felix's movements were deliberate and calm, yet they radiated power. In one swift motion, he snatched the water bottle from Trump's hand. The suddenness of it caught everyone off guard. Trump stood there, momentarily stunned, as Felix held the bottle at eye level, inspecting it as though it were a tool of precision, not a mere object. It was as if Felix was saying, "This isn't about you. It's about respect, about maintaining my position." The crowd had gone completely silent, waiting for what would come next. Felix didn't let the water spill from the bottle onto himself. He carefully poured it into his gloved palm, wiping his face with calculated precision. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely free of emotion. This was no reaction to an insult. It was a controlled response to a provocation that had been beneath him. The water he had spilled earlier was now being wiped away, as if to show that Felix had removed the stains of disrespect and returned to his original, unblemished form. Trump, meanwhile, had begun to feel the sting of his mistake. His earlier bravado was replaced by something that felt much more vulnerable. He stood there, watching Felix, who had shown no anger, no frustration, just calm, controlled power. The guard's reaction was something Trump hadn't anticipated. It was a response that required far more strength than any public outburst. It was a powerful display of discipline, of the kind of emotional control that Trump could not emulate. Felix's performance was impeccable. His eyes remained locked on Trump's, but his posture was unwavering, completely unaffected by the splashed water, the mocking tone of Trump's voice, or the murmurs of the crowd. Felix had shown his worth, not through aggression or theatrics, but through a quiet, composed strength. He had proven that true power isn't about seeking attention or making a scene. It's about staying rooted, even in the face of disrespect. As Felix returned to his original position, his rifle steady by his side, the crowd was left in awe. Felix Langdon had not just performed his duty. He had turned a moment of potential chaos into a demonstration of respect, discipline, and control. The lesson was clear. Disrespect, when met with dignity, only reveals the true strength of those who choose not to react. For Trump, this moment of quiet humiliation was one that could not be erased by tweets or viral content. It had unfolded right in front of him, with Felix maintaining his composure and making it clear that his role as a royal guard was not something to be taken lightly. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a performance. It was a lifelong commitment to discipline, and in that commitment, Felix had triumphed. The entire courtyard had become a stage, but no one could have anticipated how it would all unfold. Felix Langdon stood motionless, the quiet determination in his posture contrasting with the frantic energy of the situation around him. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity as the air crackled with tension. Tourists, who had once been laughing and snapping selfies, now stood still, some on the edges of the crowd, some holding their phones, while others simply watched, unsure of how to respond. For Felix, however, it was business as usual. His eyes remained locked on Trump, who now seemed to realize the full weight of the situation he had just stepped into. It wasn't just about a prank anymore. It was about respect and discipline, something that Trump, for all his bravado, had misunderstood. The security guards had arrived at the scene, as Felix had silently signaled for them. Without any word exchanged between Felix and the officers, the menacing stillness of the Royal Guard had communicated everything they needed to know. The officers were no longer reacting to the spilled water. They were responding to the subtle cue of Felix, acknowledging his silent authority. Trump, still holding his phone, tried to recover from the moment, but his confidence had evaporated. His audience was still present, but the amusement they had expected to see was nowhere to be found. Instead, they saw something else, a man out of his depth, a man who had underestimated the strength of the very tradition he had sought to mock. The people at that moment weren't looking at Trump for entertainment anymore. Their attention was firmly on the Royal Guard who had turned the tables on him. Sophia, still standing on the sidelines, watched as the guards closed in around Trump. Her face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. She had known for a while that Noah had been obsessed with his online persona. But now, in this moment, she was seeing the full extent of his desperation. The same desperation that had made him provoke someone who had done nothing more than simply perform his duty. As the officers approached Trump, Sophia's gaze softened, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of sadness for the man who had once been so vibrant and full of dreams. She remembered the days when he had been content with smaller achievements. Now, though, it seemed like nothing would ever satisfy him. Everything was about gaining more followers, pushing the limits of what was acceptable, all in the name of fleeting digital fame. But at this moment, it wasn't just the physical space around him that was shrinking, it was his reputation. As the officers moved in, it was clear that Trump wasn't going to get away with his actions. The guards, who had been simply performing their duties with unwavering discipline, now had a clear reason to step in. Felix's ability to maintain his composure and his restraint had not only left an impression on the crowd, but it had also given the officers the justification they needed to act. With the water bottle still in Felix's firm grip, he turned his head slowly towards Trump, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a look of malice or anger, but one of quiet, measured authority. His voice, when it came, was calm, precise, and commanding. "You will be escorted from the premises," he stated, his gaze still locked on Trump. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same unwavering discipline that had kept him on post for hours. The security guards, now surrounding Trump, began to take action. They moved swiftly but with a quiet professionalism, guiding him away from the scene. Trump, still processing the turn of events, tried to stand his ground, but there was no denying that his plan had failed. His phone, still recording, no longer captured what he had hoped for, a viral moment of chaos, but instead, it documented his own downfall. "Excuse me, sir," one of the security guards said firmly, but without aggression. "Please follow us." Noah, sensing the walls closing in, finally looked around. His audience, the crowd of tourists who had gathered to watch, was no longer on his side. Some had already turned their attention back to Felix, marveling at the guard's composure. Others were whispering to each other, their phones still in hand, but no longer directed at him. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, and Trump couldn't ignore it. His actions had backfired, and the moment of discomfort was now entirely his. Sophia, standing just off to the side, felt the full weight of the situation. She had tried to warn him, tried to point out that this was not the kind of content they should be creating, but it was too late now. The damage had been done, and Trump's reputation was hanging by a thread. She glanced down at the stone ledge nearby where she had placed the engagement ring earlier. It wasn't just a physical gesture, it symbolized something deeper. A boundary had been crossed, a line had been drawn, and Noah, for all his bravado, had been too blind to see it until it was too late. The security guards, now leading Trump away, had made it clear that this would not be tolerated. His actions had disrupted the flow of the visitors, and it was no longer a simple case of a joke gone wrong. It was a violation of protocol, a breach of respect for the people and traditions that were the very fabric of Windsor Castle. As Noah was escorted out, the last few seconds of his failed stunt seemed to slow down, almost in slow motion. His shoulders were slumped, his head low, and for the first time that day, he truly felt the weight of his actions. There was no viral content to salvage from this. No exaggerated response from Felix, no angry outburst that he could caption for social media. Instead, there was nothing but the quiet realization that true strength lies not in the spectacle you create, but in the grace with which you handle provocation. And as the final moment passed, the scene at Windsor Castle began to settle back into its natural rhythm. The tourists, now relaxed, went back to enjoying their visit. Some made their way towards the chapel, others to the castle's many other attractions. But in their minds, they carried with them the image of a royal guard who had stood his ground, who had shown them all what true strength looked like, not in anger or aggression, but in measured, dignified silence. Felix Langdon returned to his position, his stance unbroken, his presence a reminder of the values that define the Royal Guard. There would be no more disruptions, no more stunts, no more viral content from this moment on. Instead, the day would be remembered for the discipline of a soldier who, despite the heat, the provocation, and the pressure of a moment gone wrong, had remained steadfast in his duty. Sophia, meanwhile, knew that what had just happened was bigger than the both of them. It was a lesson in respect, not just for a guard on duty, but for the deeper significance of traditions and the individuals who uphold them. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever. She only hoped that Noah would learn the lesson too. Respect, patience, and restraint were qualities that could never be faked or fabricated. They had to come from within. As Noah was escorted out of the castle gates, Sophia stood there, watching him leave. Her gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer, the weight of the decision she had made settling in. Some relationships, she knew, could withstand a lot. But others, once crossed, changed things permanently. And this day, this moment at Windsor Castle, would mark the turning point in their relationship. The story of how a royal guard had silenced a viral prank with dignity would become one that they would both remember forever.